Heir's Thorne slid the court order across the scratched mahogany table. The document was 3 pages of heavy 20-pound bond paper, but to me, it felt like the cold iron of a guillotine blade. "Sign the waiver, Caris," Thorne said. His voice had the smooth, clinical polish of a Manhattan surgeon, who knew exactly how much pain he could inflict before the anesthesia wore off. "Your stepmother just wants this family tragedy resolved. We all do." I looked down at the line where my name belonged. My fingers were stiff, still carrying the phantom chill of the ICU room where my father's heart had stopped 18 days ago. I didn't look up at the 3 people sitting across from me. I didn't need to. I could already smell them. Blythe's heavy, suffocating jasmine perfume, the same one she wore to the funeral, and the expensive tanned leather of Gideon's bespoke Tom Ford jacket. The heavy gold nib of the Montblanc pen scratched against the paper. 1 stroke. 2. The signature was done. The exact moment the ink dried, the sharp metallic pop of a champagne cork split the sterile quiet of the New York Sauget's court conference room. It was an offensive, vulgar sound in a place meant for mourning. Blythe didn't even attempt a facade of grief anymore. She raised her crystal flute, her diamond rings catching the dull, overcast light bleeding through the high-arched windows facing Foley Square. "To common sense," Blythe murmured, her lips curving into a sharp, glossy smile. Gideon clinked his glass against hers, a low, guttural chuckle escaping his throat. They were celebrating because I had just authorized the immediate wire transfer of $4 million from my personal, maternal trust fund directly into the clearing account of Gideon's primary creditors. To them, I was the broken, exhausted daughter who had finally collapsed under the weight of an endless legal siege. I was the lamb paying the wolves to leave the pasture. They thought this was one of those classic, pathetic revenge stories you read about in trashy tabloids. The bitter stepdaughter making a desperate, futile stand before being crushed by the family machine. They expected me to scream, to throw a glass, or to walk out in tears. But real vengeance doesn't shout. Real vengeance is a silent ledger entry. It operates in the cold, unfeeling spaces between statutory clauses. The American legal system is a beautiful, terrifying meat grinder. On any given Tuesday, the probate courts of Manhattan are choked to the brim with greedy heirs, parasitic relatives who never spent a single night watching an old man choke on his own fluid, yet arrive with pristine manicures to carve up his corporate corpse. Blythe and Gideon were textbook specimens. They believed that because they had hired Heir's Thorne, a man whose billing rate could fund a small town, they owned the law. They believed my $4 million was their trophy. "Let the record show," the court mediator droned, his voice thick with the exhaustion of a civil servant who had seen 1,000 families tear themselves apart for money, that upon the verification of funds, the emergency asset freeze order on Lindstrom Marine Logistics is officially lifted. Corporate accounts are restored to standard operational status. Gideon leaned over the table. The scent of his expensive cologne and the sour hint of alcohol on his breath crowded my space. He tilted his head, his eyes glittering with a malicious, educated triumph. He had a degree from Wharton that his mother had bought him, and he used it like a club. "Caris, darling," he whispered, his tone dripping with a terrifyingly polite cruelty. "Dad always said you were emotional. It's a shame you didn't inherit his stomach for leverage. Running a fleet of cargo ships requires a man who understands risk, not a girl who cries over payroll. But look at the bright side. You're debt-free by proxy now. We appreciate the charity." I kept my hands flat on the table, feeling the rough grain of the wood under my palms. My pulse was a steady rhythmic thrum against my ribs. Thump, thump. My face remained a mask of pale, submissive exhaustion. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. It was a masterclass in tactical surrender. They didn't look at my eyes. If they had, they would have seen the numbers running behind my retinas. They didn't know that for the last 72 hours, while they were picking out new sports cars and planning press releases for their imminent takeover of Lindstrom Marine, I had been awake in a drab motel room in Queens with 2 forensic accountants and a retired banking regulator. They thought I had paid off Gideon's debt to save my father's company from the freeze. They thought I was desperate because the dockworkers' union was threatening a strike if payroll wasn't met by Friday. They were right about the urgency, but they were entirely wrong about the mathematics. I hadn't paid Gideon's debt. I had bought it through a triple-layered shell company registered in Dover, Delaware, an entity Heirs Thorne hadn't bothered to trace because he was too busy tracking the incoming wire. I had purchased every single scrap of Gideon's toxic, cross-collateralized promissory notes from his creditors at a 30% discount. The banks were thrilled to get 80 cents on the dollar for a high-risk gamble. On paper, I didn't just clear his name. I became his sole, primary secured creditor. And the moment the asset freeze was lifted, the 75% stake in the shipping company he was about to inherit legally became his asset. An asset tied directly to the debt I now owned. Heirs Thorne began packing his leather briefcase, the gold latches snapping shut with an authoritative clack. "We will file the formal dismissal of the broader incompetence suit tomorrow morning, Cary. You've made the right choice for the brand." "I'm sure I did, Mr. Thorne," I said. My voice was quiet, raspy from lack of sleep, perfectly playing the part of the defeated victim. Blythe stood up, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her cream wool trousers. She didn't look at me as she walked past my chair toward the heavy oak doors. She didn't need to look at a ghost. Gideon followed her, his thumb already flying across his phone screen, likely texting his broker to prepare the liquidation of the shares he thought were his. The doors closed behind them, the heavy click of the brass latch echoing like a gunshot in the empty room. I stayed seated for exactly 60 seconds, listening to the distant hum of traffic down on Center Street. Then, I reached into my coat, pulled out my encrypted phone, and dialed a direct line to the Enforcement Division of the New York State Sheriff's Office. "It's Cary Lindstrom," I said. My voice lost every ounce of its simulated frailty, turning as hard and flat as a winter river. "The freeze order is gone. The assets are officially in his name. Execute the levy." The receiver clicked into the cradle. For 5 seconds, the room remained entirely still, save for the low rhythmic hum of the air conditioning vents and the distant, muted wail of a siren down on Worth Street. I looked at my hands. They were trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the sudden violent release of adrenaline. To understand how I arrived at that table, how a 32-year-old woman with a degree in maritime logistics from SUNY Maritime ended up playing Russian roulette with a $15 million empire, you have to look at the 21 days of systematic suffocation that preceded this morning. They didn't just try to beat me in court. They tried to erase me. The legal ambush had begun on a rainy Thursday, precisely 48 hours after we put my father into the limestone vault at Woodlawn Cemetery. I was sitting in the wood-paneled office at Pier 40, the smell of brackish Hudson River water and diesel exhaust drifting through the window, when Heirs Thorne walked in unannounced. He didn't come alone. He brought a process server and 2 private security guards wearing generic tactical vests. Thorne didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply laid a certified copy of an ex parte emergency asset freeze order on my blotter. "Section 801 of the Saugus Court Procedure Act," Thorne had said, adjusting the gold links on his cuffs with agonizing slowness. "We've filed a petition alleging undue influence and temporary lack of testamentary capacity regarding Arthur's recent stock allocations to you. Until the full evidentiary hearing in 3 months, all corporate accounts, credit lines, and operational assets of Lindstrom Marine are frozen." I remembered the sudden metallic taste of panic in my mouth. "My father was lucid until the final hour, Thorne. You drew up those allocations yourself 3 years ago. Memories fail, Cary. And medical records, well, they can be interpreted in various ways," Thorne replied, his smile thin and bloodless. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, the signature authority on the master clearing accounts at J.P. Morgan Chase has been suspended." That was the first turn of the vice. Within 24 hours, the reality of that order hit the docks like a physical blow. Lindstrom Marine wasn't just a name on a stock certificate. It was 300 dockworkers, 42 diesel tugboats, and 12 ocean-going container vessels moving bulk freight between Halifax and New York. By Friday afternoon, the system began to hemorrhage. The union representative, a 6'4" crane operator named Big Mike whose father had worked for mine, stormed into my office, his boots leaving dark grease smuts on the carpet. "Cary, the boys' payroll cards just bounced," Mike said, his voice a low rumble of suppressed fury. "The bank says the corporate ID is locked out. We've got 3,000 tons of iron ore from Rotterdam sitting on the pier at Red Hook, and the terminal operators are threatening to slap a 5-figure-a-day demurrage fee on us if we don't clear the berth. What the hell is going on?" It's a temporary administrative glitch, Mike. I whispered, my throat dry. I was looking at a computer screen that showed our primary operating account, an account that held $7.4 million of liquid capital, marked with a bright, digital red flag. Account restricted by judicial decree. Glitch? My men have mortgages, Karis. If those cards aren't funded by Monday noon, the cranes go dark. Every ship in the harbor stays in the harbor. That was exactly what Blythe and Gideon wanted. They were starving the beast. They knew that a shipping company that stops moving for 72 hours becomes a carcass. Then came the knife in the dark. On Sunday morning, I picked up the Wall Street Journal from my doorstep. Page B4. A small, devastating column written by an anonymous corporate governance reporter. Internal strife and claims of incompetence threaten historic New York shipping line. The article quoted an inside source close to the family dime, claiming that Arthur Lindstrom's eldest daughter was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown following her bereavement, causing catastrophic disruptions in municipal freight contracts. My phone didn't stop ringing for 6 hours. Clients from the Port Authority, insurance underwriters from Lloyd's, fuel suppliers from New Jersey. They were all pulling back, invoking the force majeure or material adverse change clauses in their contracts. I was completely isolated. My old friends from the industry suddenly found themselves too busy to return my calls. The high society acquaintances who used to fawn over my father at the annual Met Gala looked right through me when I ran into them outside the Tribeca Whole Foods. I was drowning in plain sight, and the water was freezing. The true breaking point, however, didn't happen in a boardroom or a newspaper column. It happened in the basement archives of my father's house in Stamford, Connecticut. It was midnight on the second week of the freeze. The house was dark, smelling of dust and the stale, medicinal scent of the oxygen concentrators my father had used during his final weeks. Blythe had already changed the security codes on the main floors, but she didn't know about the old coal chute access behind the wine cellar. I sat on a cold concrete floor, illuminated only by the blue glare of my laptop, pulling data from an old unindexed network-attached storage drive that my father had kept separate from the corporate servers. He was a paranoid man of the old school. He never trusted the cloud. I found the files under a directory labeled Operational Audits 2024. They weren't audits. They were encrypted email chains between Blythe, Gideon, and a private clinic in Switzerland specializing in progressive neurology. I read the timestamps. January 2025. February 2025. 5 months before my father died. The cognitive decline is predictable. One email from Gideon to Blythe read, the language chillingly analytical. Thorne says if we increase the dosage of the nighttime sedatives, the confusion index during morning meetings will hit the legal threshold for intermittent delirium. We just need him to sign the Third Amendment to the cross-collateral agreement before his July assessment. Once his personal signature guarantees my Atlantic City debt, Karis won't be able to detach the shipping assets without triggering a total default. I stared at the text until my eyes burned. My father hadn't died of a natural, peaceful decline. His mind had been systematically dismantled by the people he shared a dinner table with. They had used his confusion to turn his life's work into a shield for Gideon's degenerate gambling habits and failed real estate speculations. The $4 million debt Gideon owed wasn't a sudden misfortune. It was a deliberate trap designed to drag my inheritance down into the mud with him. 2 nights later, they called me to the Carlisle Hotel for what Thorne termed a family settlement conference. The penthouse suite was warm, filled with the scent of burning cedar from the fireplace and the soft, jazz piano drifting up from Bemelman's bar downstairs. Blythe sat on a silk-upholstered sofa, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, sipping an amber liquid from a baccarat tumbler. Gideon stood by the window, swirling a 20-year-old scotch, looking out over the glittering canopy of Central Park. Sit down, Karis, Blythe said. Her tone was grandmotherly, gentle, the kind of voice you use for an unstable child. You look dreadful, dear. Have you been sleeping at all? I've been running payroll out of my personal savings, Blythe, I said, staying on my feet. I didn't want to sit in their warmth. The dockworkers have families. An admirable if utterly futile gesture, Eris Thorne said, stepping out from the shadows near the bar. He held a leather-bound folder. Your personal funds will be exhausted by the end of next week. After that, the union walks. The Port Authority cancels the lease on Pier 40. The company will be forced into an involuntary Chapter 11 liquidation. Everything your father built. Gone for pennies on the dollar. Gideon turned around, his handsome face marred by a small cruel twitch near his jawline. We don't want that, sister. We really don't. But we have to be practical. I have obligations. The family name is at stake. Your obligations are $4 million in unsecured debt to a predatory hedge fund in the Caymans. Gideon? I said, my voice flat. You leveraged your future on a casino development that is currently a hole in the ground. Gideon didn't flinch. He walked over, stopping just 2 inches from me, his breath warm against my cheek. He smelled of high-grade tobacco and old money. And yet, Gideon whispered, his voice smooth, polite, completely devoid of any vulgar heat, that hole in the ground is currently tied around your neck. The cross-collateral clause Dad signed means if my debt goes into default, the bank takes the ships. All of them. You want to save the old man's legacy? You pay my bill. You use that nice, clean $4 million policy your mother left you. And if I do? Blythe set her glass down with a soft clink. If you clear Gideon's ledger, Caris, we will instruct Mr. Thorne to withdraw the asset freeze immediately. We will allow you to run the operations. You can have the ships. We just want our piece. And our fair share. You're asking me to bankrupt my own personal security to clear his sins, I said. Thorne stepped forward, offering the pen. We are offering you a choice between a dignified compromise and total public destruction, Caris. In 24 hours, the banks will accelerate the debt. Choose wisely. I looked at the 3 of them. I saw the absolute certainty in their eyes. They had the law, they had the leverage, and they had the utter lack of conscience required to use them. They thought they had broken me. They didn't know that as I stood there, under the soft lights of the Carlisle penthouse, the last remaining scrap of my hesitation died. I didn't see my family anymore. I saw targets. And I knew exactly how much velocity it would take to bring them down. I walked out of the Carlisle Hotel into a driving Manhattan rain that smelled of wet asphalt and steam from the subway grates. Madison Avenue was a blur of yellow cabs and black umbrellas. My coat was soaked within 30 seconds, but the cold felt good against my skin. It reminded me that I was still alive. It reminded me that the numbness they tried to induce with their polite threats hadn't reached my core. I stopped at a public bench under the awning of a closed gallery, pulled out a second unregistered mobile phone, and dialed Eris Thorne's direct office line. I didn't want him to have time to consult with Blythe. I wanted him isolated. Thorne, I said when the line clicked open. I let my breath hitch slightly, mimicking a woman on the edge of a panic attack. It's Caris. I can't let the company collapse. I'll sign the agreement. I'll pay Gideon's debt. There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end. I could hear the faint rustle of high-grade paper. Thorne was likely smiling, his fingers smoothing his silk tie. A sensible choice, Caris. For everyone involved. When can we expect the wire? My mother's trust is tied up in a secondary liquidity pool at Vanguard Trust in Jersey. I lied, my voice trembling perfectly. It takes time to break the certificates without triggering a federal audit. I need 48 hours. Have the withdrawal documents for the asset freeze ready at the Sauget's court by Thursday morning. If the cranes aren't moving by Friday, the deal is off. 48 hours is acceptable, Thorne said, his tone dripping with the smooth condescension of a man who believed he had just successfully housebroken a difficult animal. I will instruct the court clerk to schedule an emergency chamber session for Thursday at 10. Don't be late, Caris. The banks won't wait a third time. I hung up without saying goodbye. I took a deep breath, the damp air filling my lungs. Step 1 was complete. I had given them a deadline wrapped in a white flag. A greedy man with a deadline doesn't ask questions. He simply watches the clock and counts his unearned money. 10 minutes later, I boarded a westbound E-train toward Queens. My destination wasn't the glass towers of Wall Street or the sleek offices of Lindstrom Marine at Pier 40. I was heading to a nondescript, brick-fronted motel off the Van Wyck Expressway, a place where the neon sign buzzed in a broken rhythm, and the air inside smelled permanently of old carpet and industrial bleach. Room 114 was registered to a shell company that didn't exist on any public index. Inside, the cheap laminate table was covered by 3 heavy, black-bound ledgers and 2 high-speed Lenovo laptops connected to a secure satellite hotspot. Sitting in the corner under a dull yellow lamp was Abe Miller. Abe was 68, carried 60 pounds of extra weight around his middle, and had spent 34 years as the chief auditor for the New York State Department of Financial Services before the state forced him to retire. He was the only man my father trusted with the true inner skeleton of our corporate finances. "They bit," I said, dropping my wet coat onto the spare bed. Abe didn't look up from his screen. His thick ink-stained thumb flicked a page of a ledger. "Of course they did. Gideon's primary lenders have been squeezing his throat for 6 months. When you give a drowning man a hand, he doesn't check if you're wearing a brass knuckle." I sat across from him, the small wooden chair creaking under my weight. "Show me the exact mechanics of the note, Abe. I want the numbers. No generalizations." Abe turned one of the laptops toward me. The screen displayed a digitized copy of a master promissory note, dated November 14, 2024. The borrower was listed as Gideon Vance Holdings LLC. The lender was Apex Capital Partners, a high-yield, aggressive private credit fund based out of Grand Cayman. The principal amount, $4 million flat. The interest rate, a staggering 14%, floating, with a default penalty that doubled the spread the moment a single payment was missed by more than 5 business days. "Here is the heartbeat of the trap, Cary," Abe said, tapping the glass with a yellow pencil. "Look at Clause 14b, the cross-collateralization provision." I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the dense 8-point legal type. My father's signature was at the bottom of the page, a shaky, uneven script that looked entirely different from the bold, clean hand he had used his entire life. The sight of it sent a cold spike of fury through my chest. Clause 14b states that in the event of a technical default by the primary borrower, I read aloud, my voice steadying into the clinical tone of a maritime lawyer, the lender maintains the right to attach any and all assets currently held in the Lindstrom family trust, provided those assets are designated as future distributions to the primary borrower or his immediate kin. "Exactly," Abe grunted. "Gideon didn't just borrow money. He used your father's failing health to lock the shipping company into a legal vice. If Apex defaults Gideon, they don't just go after his cars or his penthouse. They seize his 75% future stake in Lindstrom Marine. That's why Heiress Thorne filed the asset freeze. He wanted to keep the company's cash locked up, so you couldn't use corporate funds to pay the dock workers, forcing you to use your personal maternal inheritance to clear Gideon's ledger." "But they made an assumption," I whispered. My fingers began to tap a slow, rhythmic pattern against the edge of the table. "They assumed I would pay the bank on behalf of Gideon." "A fatal assumption," Abe agreed, a grim, humorless smile appearing beneath his gray mustache. "They think like heirs. They think in terms of gifts and charity. They don't think like institutional liquidators." I reached into my bag, pulled out a stack of notary forms I had obtained from a private bank clerk in Brooklyn an hour earlier, and slid them toward Abe. "Let's begin the transfer. Open the Dover registry. We need Vanguard Recovery LLC fully active by midnight." Abe's fingers began to fly across the keyboard, the sharp, rapid clack-clack-clack filling the small motel room. Every action I took over the next 3 hours was designed to remain entirely invisible to Heiress Thorne's network of court informants. First, I authorized the liquidation of $4 million in blue-chip municipal bonds held in my mother's private estate account at Vanguard Trust. But the funds weren't directed to Apex Capital's public collection account in New York. Instead, they were routed through a series of corresponding banks in Wilmington, Delaware, before landing in the escrow account of a boutique law firm specializing in distressed debt acquisitions. "Why Delaware?" a regular observer might ask. Because under Delaware General Corporation Law, a Title VIII entity can shield the identity of its beneficial owners behind a registered agent, leaving no public footprint for 45 days. To the world, Vanguard Recovery LLC was just another faceless vulture fund buying up bad paper in a down market. Apex just accepted the wire, Abe announced at exactly 2:14 a.m. He pointed to a digital confirmation screen showing an incoming ledger match. They were ecstatic. Gideon's note has been sitting on their books as a Class 5 non-performing asset for 180 days. Their risk committee was preparing to write it off for 50 cents on the dollar next quarter. We offered them 85 cents. They didn't ask questions. They just signed the assignment of lien. I reached out and took the printout that slid out of the portable Epson printer on the floor. It was a 2-page document titled Absolute Assignment of Promissory Note and Associated Security Interests. I ran my thumb over the fresh ink. The legal reality had shifted in the span of 4 hours, but to anyone looking from the outside, nothing had changed. Gideon still owed $4 million. The cross-collateral agreement against Lindstrom Marine was still fully active. The only difference, the one difference that would cost them everything, was that the man who owned Gideon's financial life was no longer a distant hedge fund in the Caymans. The man was me. Now for the second layer, I said, setting the assignment document aside. We need the exact text of the emergency asset freeze order that Thorne filed last week. Abe pulled up the New York County Court docket on his second monitor. Here it is. Case number 45092/2026. Thorne's motion for the injunction is based entirely on the argument that Lindstrom Marine is facing irreparable corporate waste and imminent insolvency due to the outstanding cross-collateral liability hanging over Gideon's future shares. Read the termination trigger, Abe. Abe scrolled down to page 11 of the judge's signed decree. The freeze remains in effect until such time as the underlying debt to Apex Capital Partners is either satisfied, dismissed, or the claim is withdrawn by the moving party. Satisfied, dismissed, or withdrawn, I repeated, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. Thorne thinks he's going to court on Thursday to withdraw the motion because the debt is satisfied. He wrote the withdrawal order himself. He's going to present it to the judge as a mutual settlement. But the debt isn't satisfied, Abe noted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The debt was merely assigned. Still exists. It's just moved to a new house. And that, I said, leaning back in the creaking chair as the rain continued to beat against the cracked window of room 114, is where their own arrogance becomes the anchor that drags them to the bottom of the East River. They want a performance? I'll give them a masterpiece of compliance. I'll give them exactly what they asked for, until they realize what they asked for is a death warrant. By Tuesday afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving Manhattan wrapped in a sticky, humid heat. I sat in a dented Ford Taurus parked across the street from Manhattan Motor Cars on West 51st. The engine was idling, the air conditioning blowing a thin, stale stream of cool air against my face. Through the showroom's floor-to-ceiling glass, I watched Gideon. He was standing next to a 2026 Aston Martin DBS Volante, liquid silver, carbon fiber trim, dark blue leather interior. Gideon didn't just look at the car. He owned the space around it. He was laughing, gesturing with a sleek, black titanium American Express card toward a salesman who was bowing just low enough to show he smelled a massive commission. 36 hours before a single asset had been legally distributed from my father's estate, Gideon was already spending the equity. Arrogance is a spectacular blindfold. 6 hours earlier, Apex Capital Partners had issued an automated, encrypted clearing notice to Heiress Thorne's office. The system text was brief. Account ledger balance for Gideon Vance Holdings LLC 0. Status transferred. Gideon saw the word 0, and his mind stopped processing further details. In his universe, 0 balance meant victory. It meant the quiet, submissive girl from SUNY Maritime had broken her mother's trust fund, swallowed her pride, and saved his skin just like they planned at the Carlisle. He didn't look at the word transferred. He didn't ask who took the paper. To a man like Gideon, the mechanics didn't matter. Only the liquidity did. I watched him sign a temporary lease-to-purchase agreement on the hood of the silver sports car. He used a bridge loan from a boutique firm in Mayfair, using his anticipated unencumbered shares in Lindstrom Marine as the primary collateral. The interest rate on the bridge loan was criminal, but Gideon didn't care about interest rates. He cared about the roar of a V12 engine on the West Side Highway. He didn't know that every stroke of his pen on that dealership paperwork was being logged by Abe Miller, sitting in his dim motel room, tracking the UC1 financing statements filed in real time with the New York Department of State. He just triggered the acceleration clause. Abe's voice came through my earpiece, dry and scratchy. The minute he pledged those unallocated shares to a secondary lender, he violated Section 4 of his original promissory note with Apex. He's technically tabbing an unauthorized encumbrance on a debt-attached asset. Does Thorne know? I asked, watching Gideon climb into the driver's seat of the Aston Martin, his face flushed with the cheap high of unearned luxury. Thorn is at the Pierre Hotel, Abe said. I heard the distinct sound of a keyboard tapping in the background. He's currently drafting a memorandum of understanding. Our server tap shows he's corresponding with the legal team at Novice Group. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Novice Group was our primary competitor in the North Atlantic sector. For 30 years, my father had fought them for every foot of berth at the Red Hook terminal. Now, less than a month after his heart stopped, Blythe and Gideon were preparing to hand them the keys to the kingdom. The memorandum of understanding was simple, predatory, and entirely illegal under standard probate rules, if anyone bothered to look closely. Gideon was selling an option for 30% of Lindstrom Marine's voting stock to Novice Group for a cash injection of $6 million. The closing date on the option was set for Thursday at noon, exactly 2 hours after the Syagits court session. They were cashing out before the body in the vault was even cold. At 4 p.m., I drove down to Pier 40. The administrative offices were quiet, the air smelling faintly of old coffee and harbor salt. I walked past the empty cubicles to the corner office that used to be my father's. The mahogany desk was completely bare, stripped of his brass ship model, his nautical charts, his family photos. Blythe had sent a packing crew over the weekend to clear out the clutter. I stood by the window, watching the tide pull the gray water of the Hudson south toward the upper bay. Out on the water, 2 of our tugboats, the Arthur L. and the Caris Marie, were sitting idle at the pier, their diesel engines cold. The dockworkers were gathered near the security gate, smoking in small tense groups, their faces hard under their yellow hard hats. They looked like men waiting for a storm to hit. Eris Thorn walked in 10 minutes later. He didn't knock. He didn't carry a briefcase this time. He just had a single cream-colored manila folder in his left hand. He looked around the empty office with the detached approval of an insurance adjuster evaluating a fire site. The paperwork is finalized for Thursday morning, Caris, Thorn said, leaning against the doorframe. His voice had that smooth country club timbre that made every threat sound like a dinner invitation. The judge signed off on the expedited docket. 10 a.m. sharp. Room 504. And the union payroll? I asked, keeping my back to him, staring out at the river. The moment the judge signs the withdrawal order, the clearing accounts will be unlocked. JP Morgan will fund the payroll cards within 20 minutes. Your men will get their money, Caris. Assuming, of course, your wire from Vanguard Trust clears our escrow account by 9. He thought he was being subtle. He was reminding me that he held the oxygen tube. If I hesitated, if I checked the wording, if I asked for a recess. The crane stayed dark and Lindstrom Marine died on the table. The wire is already in the Federal Reserve System, Mr. Thorn, I said, turning around to face him. I kept my chin down, my eyes fixed on his polished Oxfords. I let him see the dark circles under my eyes, the slight tremor in my right hand. I just want this over. I want my father's name cleared of the incompetence claim. Of course you do, Thorn said, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. He stepped forward and laid the folder on the bare desk. Review the decree draft if you must. It's standard language. Mutual release of claims. Dissolution of the injunction. No admission of liability from either side. He didn't mention the Novice Group MOU. He didn't mention the Aston Martin currently parked in the VIP lot at the Carlisle. He didn't check the chain of title on the debt assignment because, in his mind, a girl from a state maritime college didn't have the leverage to buy a cup of coffee at a diner, let alone a $4 million portfolio from a Cayman Island hedge fund. He looked down at me, his eyes cold and empty behind his designer frames. You've done the smart thing, Caris. Your father was a great man, but his era is done. The market requires efficiency, not sentiment. Efficiency, I repeated, the word cold and heavy in my throat. Exactly, Thorn said, turning toward the exit. See you in court, Caris. We're something professional. The press likes a clean narrative. The door closed with a soft, expensive click. I walked over to the desk, picked up the folder, and looked at the draft decree. My name was typed at the bottom in neat, unfeeling Times New Roman. Beside it was a blank line waiting for the judge's signature. I pulled out my phone and sent a 2-word text to Abe Miller, green light. Room 504 of the New York County Sagat's Court did not look like a place where a dynasty would be dismantled. It smelled of lemon pledge, old buckram binders, and 70 years of institutional anxiety. The morning sun, cutting through the high, grimy windows facing Center Street, illuminated millions of dust motes dancing in the stale air. In the back, the court stenographer's machine made a faint rhythmic clack-clack-clack, a sound like a distant cicada counting down the seconds. Judge Eleanor Harrison sat behind the massive, elevated oak bench. Her reading glasses were perched dangerously low on her nose, her sharp gray eyes scanning the stipulation papers with the profound fatigue of a woman who had spent 3 decades watching wealthy families tear each other's throats out for real estate and corporate control. Heirs Thorne stood at the center podium. His charcoal Brioni suit was immaculate, his posture radiating the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who had never lost a fight where the rules were written on paper. Behind him sat Blythe and Gideon. Blythe was leaning back, her emerald silk dress catching the light, her fingers casually adjusting the clasp of her pearl necklace. Gideon looked bored. He was turning his heavy gold signet ring around his finger, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the door, eager to get to the closing meeting with novice group. "Your Honor," Thorne's voice boomed, perfectly balanced, carrying the rich, country club timbre that judges liked. "We are pleased to inform the court that a private settlement has been reached. The respondent, Miss Caris Lindstrom, has utilized her independent maternal funds to satisfy the outstanding $4 million primary liability with Apex Capital Partners. As the underlying threat of corporate insolvency has been resolved, we move for the immediate dissolution of the emergency asset freeze order on Lindstrom Marine Logistics." Judge Harrison didn't look up from her desk. She flipped a page. The crisp paper sounded like a dry leaf crushing underfoot. "Miss Lindstrom," she said, her gravelly voice echoing in the quiet room. "Step forward, please." I stood up from the respondent's table. I wore no jewelry, no designer wool. Just a plain black blazer and a white cotton shirt. I kept my chin tucked, my shoulders slightly slumped, letting the room see exactly what they wanted to see. A broken girl who had run out of options. I walked to the opposite side of the podium. "You are appearing pro se today, Miss Lindstrom?" Judge Harrison asked, her eyes finally lifting, drilling into mine. "I am, Your Honor," I whispered. I let my voice catch just a little on the final syllable. "And you understand the weight of this stipulation?" Harrison tapped the document with a blunt finger. "By paying off your stepbrother's personal debt with your maternal trust, you are releasing these funds permanently. You cannot seek reimbursement from the primary estate once this freeze is lifted. You are, for all intents and purposes, gifting this liquidity to the petitioners." From the table behind me, I heard Gideon let out a short, soft breath through his nose. A muffled scoff of pure aristocratic derision. He thought I was an idiot. He thought my father's blood had turned to water in my veins. "I understand, Your Honor," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. I cannot let the dockworkers lose their jobs. If the cranes don't move by Friday, the company dies. My father's name dies with it. I want the freeze gone." Blythe leaned over and tapped Thorne's elbow, her face tight with a victorious predatory hunger. She gave him a short nod. "Finish it," her eyes said. "Sign the papers before she changes her mind." The court clerk slid the 3-page stipulation across the varnished wood of the podium. Beside it lay a cheap black plastic ballpoint pen. Picked it up. My fingers didn't tremble, not really, but I forced a slight hesitation, holding the nib a millimeter above the paper for 3 long seconds. I wanted them to feel the breath catch in their throats. I wanted them to taste the absolute certainty of their triumph. Then I signed. Caris Lindstrom. Before the ink could even settle into the grain of the bond paper, Gideon was on his feet. He didn't wait for the clerk to pass the folder. He stepped up to the podium, pulled a heavy, solid gold Montblanc fountain pen from his breast pocket, and slashed his signature across the debtor's acknowledgement line with a violent, arrogant stroke. Clack. Blythe's diamond rings clicked sharply against the wooden rail as she stood up beside him, her signature following his within 5 seconds. They were laughing now, not out loud but with their eyes, exchange a glance of supreme educated malice. Judge Harrison took the folder back. She glanced at the signatures, adjusted her glasses, and brought her heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. Crack. The stipulation is accepted, Judge Harrison droned, her voice already moving to the next case on her mind. The emergency asset freeze order is hereby dissolved. Lindstrom Marine's master clearing accounts are unlocked, and the 75% residual share allocation of the estate is legally transferred into the name of Gideon Vance. Case dismissed. Thank you, Your Honor, Heiress Thorne said, bowing his head with practiced elegance. He turned toward his leather briefcase, snapping the gold latches open with a sharp, definitive click. Gideon Blythe, let's go. The car is downstairs. Gideon buttoned his Tom Ford jacket, giving me a final, pitying look as he began to walk toward the swinging wooden gates of the bar. Nice doing business with you, little sister, he murmured, his voice smooth, polite, and completely lethal. Enjoy the docks. Your Honor, I said. The word was not loud, but the room froze. The simulated frailty in my voice was gone. The rasp was gone. It was a cold, flat iron tone. The voice of a surveyor measuring a grave. Thorne stopped mid-motion, his hand hovering over his briefcase. Gideon stopped 3 feet from the gate, his brow furrowing in sudden, minor annoyance. Blythe turned back, her hand frozen on the strap of her handbag. I reached into my manila folder and pulled out a fresh, blueback document. It bore the heavy, wet ink seal of the New York State Supreme Court Clerk's office, stamped exactly 12 minutes before we walked into room 504. Before this court adjourns its session, I said, walking directly to the center podium, my heels striking the terrazzo floor with the steady, unyielding rhythm of a ticking clock. I am filing an immediate petition for an emergency writ of execution and judicial foreclosure against the newly transferred assets of Gideon Vance. Thorne's head snapped up. His polite country club smile didn't vanish. It simply rigidified, turning into a grotesque mask. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The matter is dismissed. The debt to Apex Capital has been paid. The debt to Apex was never paid, Mr. Thorne, I said, handing the certified copy to the court bailiff, who passed it up to Judge Harrison. On Tuesday morning at 2:14 a.m., Apex Capital Partners executed a full, absolute assignment of Gideon Vance's promissory notes, his security agreements, and his cross-collateralization liens to an independent corporate entity, Vanguard Recovery LLC. I am the sole managing member and 100% equity owner of Vanguard Recovery. The silence that followed was total. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that happens inside a submarine right before the hull buckles under the pressure. Gideon's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His face, usually flushed with expensive scotch and arrogance, began to lose its color, turning the shade of old milk. As Mr. Vance's primary secured creditor, I continued, looking directly into Thorne's eyes, watching the pupils dilate in sudden sharp terror. I am enforcing my rights under Section 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code. Less than 24 hours ago, Mr. Vance executed an unauthorized secondary pledge of his unallocated estate shares to secure a luxury vehicle lease at Manhattan Motor Cars. Concurrently, he signed a memorandum of understanding to sell 30% of those same shares to the Novice Group. Under Clause 14b of the original note, a clause you drafted yourself, Mr. Thorne, any subsequent encumbrance of the collateral without the express written consent of the note holder triggers an immediate, non-curable default of the entire principal. Judge Harrison's eyes were flying across the blue-backed papers. Her eyebrows shot up into her hairline. She looked down at Thorne, her expression hardening into something terrifying. Furthermore, I said, my voice dropping an octave, cold and level, because the default occurred while the assets were legally locked, the interest has accelerated to the contractual default rate of 28%, compounded weekly, plus non-compliance penalties. The total payoff balance currently standing on Gideon's ledger is exactly $8,142,000.12. A single thick drop of sweat broke from Heiress Thorne's hairline. It traced a slow, wet path down the side of his cheek, glistening in the dull court light before soaking into his pristine collar. His fingers gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned white, then gray. This is an ambush, Thorne stammered, his polished Manhattan veneer cracking open to reveal the raw panic underneath. Your Honor, she acted in bad faith. She misled my clients. I did exactly what you demanded, Mr. Thorne, I said. I turned my head slowly, looking at Gideon. He looked like a man who had stepped out of an airplane without a parachute. His chest was heaving, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. You wanted the $4 million out of my hands. It is. You wanted the freeze lifted so Gideon could legally own the 75% share of Lindstrom Marine. He does. And because he owns it, I am seizing it. Right now. Blythe quired, her hand dropping her handbag. The leather hit the floor with a heavy, dull thud, its contents spilling out across the linoleum. Expensive lipsticks, gold compacts, keys to a house that no longer belonged to her. The math is quite simple, Gideon, I whispered across the empty space between us. Your inheritance is valued at exactly $7.5 million. Your debt to my company is $8.1 million. You are short $642,000. The sheriff's deputies are currently outside Manhattan motor cars to attach the Aston Martin. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the Stamford property before the foreclosure sale. Gideon staggered back half a step, his hip hitting the swinging gate. He looked down at his gold pen, still clutched in his hand, the ink that had ruined him still wet on the paper. He looked at his mother, then at Thorne, but neither of them would look back. They were already looking at a corpse. Judge Harrison did not hesitate. Her gold-rimmed glasses came off, clattering against the bench. She picked up her pen, a heavy black institutional rollerball, and signed the writ of execution with 3 swift, jagged strokes. Writ granted, Harrison said. Her voice was flat, carrying the cold finality of an iron gate swinging shut. The court finds a prima facie case of non-curable default on the assigned notes. The New York County Sheriff is authorized to attach all transferred assets immediately. Mr. Thorne, I suggest you advise your client to cooperate. This session is adjourned. The gavel came down. A single sharp crack that signaled the end of Gideon's world. Thorne didn't move. He couldn't. He stood at the podium like a statue carved from cheap salt, his eyes fixed on the signed order. The elite Manhattan fixer who charged $1,200 an hour had just been outmaneuvered by a 32-year-old woman using a Delaware shell company and his own legal clauses. Gideon finally found his voice. It wasn't smooth anymore. It was a high, thin screech. The sound of a trapped animal when it sees the hunter's boots. You can't do this. That's my father's company. Those shares are worth millions. You can't just take them. I turned to him. I didn't smile. A smile would have given him comfort, would have made it look like a personal grudge. I wanted him to see the truth. That this was just a cold piece of arithmetic. I'm not taking them, Gideon, I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel through fat. You sold them. The moment you signed that unauthorized pledge to Manhattan Motor Cars, and the moment you executed that secret option with Novice Group, you broke the covenant. You wanted the asset freeze lifted so you could hold the shares in your own name. You got exactly what you asked for. But you forgot the basic rule of leverage. An asset in your name is an asset your creditors can seize. Karis, please, Blythe whispered. She was on her knees now, her expensive emerald dress dragging in the dust of the courtroom floor. Her fingers reaching out toward the hem of my blazer. The porcelain mask of the Upper East Side matriarch had completely melted away, leaving only a terrified, aging woman facing absolute destitution. The Stamford house. It's my home. Your father bought it for me. You can't let them take the house. My father didn't buy that house, Blythe, I said, stepping back so her fingers couldn't touch my shoes. He mortgaged it. He mortgaged it to the hilt to pay for your luxury safaris in Kenya and Gideon's margin calls in Atlantic City. The mortgage note was tied to Gideon's commercial credit line at Apex. The line I now own. You have 30 days to pack your things. The movers will be paid for by Vanguard Recovery. Consider that my final act of family charity. I didn't wait for her to answer. I picked up my manila folder, tucked it securely under my arm, and walked through the swinging wooden gates of the bar. As I passed Heiress Thorne, he leaned in, his face gray, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. You think you've won, Lindstrom? Novice Group will sue. They have a signed memorandum of understanding. They'll tie you up in federal court for a decade. I stopped. I looked at him through the glass of his own arrogance. Let them sue, Thorne. A memorandum of understanding on an asset the seller didn't legally own at the time of signing isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It's a void contract. And when Novice realizes Gideon took their $200,000 non-refundable retainer while his shares were encumbered. They won't come after me. They'll go after him for grand larceny. And they'll probably disbar you for facilitating it. The look that came over Thorne's face was worth every cent of the $4 million I had spent. It was the realization that his career, his reputation, and his freedom were now tied to a sinking ship. I pushed open the heavy double doors of room 504 and walked out into the corridor. The transition from the sterile, suffocating air of the courthouse to the open terrace of Foley Square was like breaking through the surface of a deep pool. The morning sun was bright now, baking the granite steps, the sky a clean, sharp blue. Down on Center Street, the yellow cabs were honking, the city moving at its usual brutal pace. My phone buzzed in my palm. A single text from the chief accounting officer at J.P. Morgan Chase. Incoming wire cleared. Account restrictions removed. Union payroll cards funded. Red Hook cranes operational as of 10:14 a.m. I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady now. The cranes were moving. The ships would unload. The men my father had protected for 30 years would go home to their families with full pockets. The line had survived the parasites. I walked down the granite steps, the noise of Manhattan rising up to greet me like a familiar song. I was bone-deep tired. The motel room in Queens, the endless spreadsheets, the ghost of my father's dying mind. They would stay with me for a long time. But as I reached the sidewalk, I felt a sudden violent wash of clean air in my chest. I was free. They thought they could use my grief as a weakness. They thought they could use the law as a club to beat me into submission. But they forgot that the law doesn't care about your luxury lifestyle, your Wharton degrees, or your expensive perfume. The law only cares about the ledger. And when the ledger balances, the debt must be collected. Blythe and Gideon believed they were the ones pulling the strings, but their own greed became the noose they put around their necks. They wanted a payout and they got a lesson in absolute compliance. But it makes you think, doesn't it? In a world where the system can be bought, where people with enough money can freeze your life with a single signature, how far would you go to protect your family's legacy? Would you stay quiet? Or would you build a better trap? Let me know what you would have done in my shoes down in the comments below. If you want to see how the foreclosure sale of the Stanford estate plays out, and what happens when the FBI starts looking into Heir's Thorne's escrow accounts, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The books are open, and the next ledger entry is coming soon. Thanks for listening.